there was always this idea that I needed to make the most of the time overseas because I would, it was a privileged time in life when I'm single, I don't have a house, I don't have children, I'm earning money through working, and I'm in a kind of situation where there's nothing stopping me from basically doing whatever I want to do. And so I did that.
Architects Abroad, a podcast brought to you by Brickworks Building Products.
G'day, I'm Tim Ross and welcome to Architects Abroad, a podcast for Brickworks Building Products. Travelling overseas is deeply embedded in the Australian psyche, and because of our relative isolation, we are drawn to exploring the world. We all know about the formative power of backpacking, but what about the vocational value of working overseas? What are the gains, both personal and professional, from time spent working abroad? In this episode, we check out the passport pages of Perth architect Adrian Iredale, one of the directors of Iredale, Peterson, Hook. Adrian is a highly experienced and award-winning architect who is about to share his overseas adventures from the early to mid-90s. What I really like about his recollections is the importance he puts on friendships he has made through travel. He's a wonderful bloke, and I know you're going to love this chat. Adrian, good to chat, buddy. How are you?
Wonderful, Tim. Really good to talk with you again. It's been a long time.
It's been a long time. I haven't seen you since Venice, I don't think. Oh, maybe actually, I would have seen you somewhere before then. I think one of the conferences or something.
Yeah.
It just certainly has been a different year. We are going to talk about a bit about travel, but let's start with what made you realise that architecture was the career for you?
Oh, look, it happened quite young for me, I think. And it came through, in some ways, travel and looking at buildings. And a lot of that travel was country towns of Western Australia, and going into small towns was always wonderful because everything was such a contrast to the city and the suburbs. And I tended to often sit down and sketch buildings, sketch monuments, in between sketching the beach.
My experience of country towns in Western Australia is reasonably limited, but what were the sort of buildings that were catching your eye, or what was it that was impressive?
It was often the oddity of things that they almost felt as though they were somewhat of a stage set, lined up along a street, mixture of timber buildings with local stone buildings. So fascinating in many ways because they were often built out of whatever was available close by. So there was a strong regional and, in a way, site-specific quality about them. And that's often what interested me, I think, more than anything else. It's interesting reflecting upon those times because as much as it wasn't conscious at the time, and I think that's a general thing about my life to date, the way things have occurred, and when I reflect back on them, a lot of it just happens subconsciously, but there was always this desire to do something, even though I wasn't conscious of it at the time.
You're a student in Perth, the most isolated city in the world. Is it deep in your heart that you've got to go and have a look at some other things? You got to see the world?
It certainly is. And that was also, even from first year architecture, that was something that was taught to us about the world around us. But interestingly, we also then had great lecturers such as Duncan Richards, who's still an old colleague and friend who's living in New South Wales now, that he would teach us about international examples, but then he would always bring it to an Australian, West Australian example as well. So we could physically visit buildings that had qualities of those buildings that we were interested in seeing overseas. But West Australians in general tended to go to Europe rather than go to the East to visit projects, which was another fascinating consequence of being on the western fringe of the continent, that you tended to see Europe as being the brave new frontier that was more accessible in many ways. than travelling in an easterly direction. So there's a strong tradition of West Australian graduates and architects actually going to Europe, in particular London, to work, and then to come back and study modernism and to bring that skill base back to Perth and continue to practice.
We'll talk about your own home in a second, but let's get back to the desire to get away. And you finish university and you head overseas.
Yes, the initial desire was one to actually go and surf for about 8 months. I was pretty exhausted by the time I finished university, and I worked quickly and long enough to be registered. So after a year and a half of graduating, I managed to register and thought, right, I now need to go overseas. And initially it was really just to unwind and go surfing with a couple of friends around France and Spain and Portugal. And after that, then it was time to reconnect with architecture. Not that I ever gave up on it, but it was just a sort of interesting time of, I think I realised at one point when I was walking down the beach in France that I was probably more relaxed than I could remember, which was a strange scenario to be in, headphones on in those days, walking down the beach going, I don't think I've ever felt this relaxed. But then architecture it crept back, couldn't resist, and I needed to go and start visiting buildings. And a friend came across from Perth that I also studied with, Glenn Russell, and off we went, initially with a quick tour in London, quick tour in New York, but then the main tour we did was through Europe and visiting the classics of Rome and Florence and Naples and then down to Barcelona via Nice and other places. And Barcelona ended up being probably one of the most intriguing experiences for me. A place I intended to stay for 2 days and eventually stayed for 2 weeks until I'd literally run out of money.
What was the appeal for you there?
Look, incredible vitality more than anything else, I think, and an incredible response to. You go around, you see the Gaudi buildings, obviously all unfinished at that time, or predominantly unfinished. But then behind that, there's this fantastic freshness of a legacy of architects and people that were just really starting to emerge onto the international scene, such as Miralis Piños, Carme Piños, and the late Enrique Miralis, whose practice, Carme Piños is still practicing today, and Enrique Miralis' practice is still going with Benedetta Tagliabue. There was an incredible dynamic vitality in their work, which responded to each site, but with a certain sort of way of challenging the site, but also at the same time, I think a deep understanding of local history and also craftsmanship. And that legacy still continues today. So that eventually, through the interest of studying the work in Barcelona, I later went to formally study under Enrique Miralis and Peter Cook at the Staatliche Hochschule für Bildende Künste, the Städelschule in Frankfurt.
And the act of studying overseas, what did you gain from that?
Look, I gained quite a few different things. One is the network of friendships that you build up from both working overseas, studying overseas, attending lectures. There's lifelong friendships that I've actually built up, which are still really active today. So Peter Cook has been a great, in a way, ambassador for us and mentor for us, for both Martin, Finn and myself. It's a really interesting scenario where, as students, Finn was probably mostly interested in Archie Graham's work and Cedric Price. And then Martin ended up studying under Sir Peter Cook at the Bartlett in London, and then I ended up studying under him in Frankfurt. And he's been something that sort of, in a way, represented and underpinned all of IPH over the years. And then Peter Wilson from Wallace Wilson, a former gold medalist of the Australian Institute of Architects, expat Australian that's based in Münster, grew up in Melbourne and did his undergrad studies at Melbourne Uni, and then went and finished his main course and architecture degree at the Architecture Association, and eventually went on to set up practice with his partner, Julia Bollos Wilson, and won a pretty significant competition in Münster in Germany for a city library. And at that time, they were just young architects, and they spent about a 5 to 6 year period working on that project. And they're still friends today. We recently did a competition with Peter Wilson. We were unsuccessful, but I think the ongoing process of learning through working with people that we've met and known now for some 25 odd years, it still intrigues us today that we know there's a lot more to learn. And by continuing to associate with these people that we initially met through being overseas, and even the people we studied with, which are at a similar sort of level and age group to us, the collaboration approach just keeps building the knowledge base and taking us into a different realm of science. That would be one thing.
I'm delighted that you talked about the relationships and the friendships that you made as the first thing. That's the most important thing to you. I think that it's really wonderful to hear, Adrian. Not that I expected you to reel off a bunch of architectural jargon, but the understanding that it's what you can gain on all different levels from travel is really important, and the interconnection of personal and work is, for those of us who love what we do, are one and the same, and our friendships come from what we love doing. And as I said, it's delightful to hear from that. Did you find yourself staying away for a longer period of time than you thought?
To some extent, yes. Interesting thing for me in the back of my mind, I always knew I would come home, and Perth being home. So that meant, I believe it meant I approached my travels and the working and the study time, both formal and informal study time, with a lot of enthusiasm and zest, really, that every weekend there'd be a study tour, would go somewhere, whether it was Berlin surrounds, or a different country within Europe, take a couple of days off work and start traveling. So there was always this idea that I needed to make the most of the time overseas, because I would, it was a privileged time in life when I'm single, I don't have a house, I don't have children, I'm earning money through working, and I'm in a kind of situation where there's nothing stopping me from basically doing whatever I want to do. And so I did that, and I had Glenn Russell, another architect, that we shared a house together, and most weekends we'd be off on some adventure. We'd just write our own little itinerary and say, well, let's go to this country. Here's the buildings we want to go and see. Let's go and do it.
It sounds idyllic. Was there any downsides? Doesn't sound like it.
No, I think if there's any downsides, it's more the fear that we missed out on something. Like even now, I still go back to Berlin, because I still feel like there's more in a city like Berlin, which is so rich and ever evolving. I still feel like there's things to discover. So every opportunity I have to go to Europe, and in particular, the old habits of revisiting cities that you've lived in or visited 4 or 5 times before, and you find yourself almost referring to them as your second home, and you feel really comfortable in them, but at the same time, you feel like there's a collection of things that you haven't done yet, which you really need to go and discover.
Yeah, that's interesting, how the familiarity and the warmth you have for a city can draw you back, and then you are torn between, I should be seeing something else. But when it's in your heart, isn't it? Yeah, let's talk. So when you came home, how did the experiences that you had overseas influence your work?
An interesting one, because initially I found it was somewhat of a cultural shock coming back to Perth. I'd spent by then a couple of years in Berlin and worked in Frankfurt, and I left, came back, and Perth at the time didn't evolve much. It hadn't changed much, but me as a person had changed considerably because of my experiences. So I found myself really initially struggling to actually find my place. And I worked in a larger commercial practice for a little while, and then I really needed to set up my own practice. I just found, like I think a lot of architects that come to setting up a practice, it's something you simply have to do, regardless of what the risk is. You need to do it, otherwise you just need to get out of architecture. And so I set up my own little practice, and by then I'd moved into the city, into an apartment on Mount Street that leads up to Kings Park, a 10-story modernist building. So the sort of work that took me to Berlin to begin with and to Europe, I was then living in an apartment of that type that was actually designed by an Austrian architect. So it was really sort of initial 5 years or so was a process of readapting and trying to hang on to the influence of those experiences. And the first few projects I did were very much around this modernist ideology, European modernist ideology, without sufficient adaptation to our local culture. So I do these white modernist houses with intense courtyards where you had to sit there with your sunglasses on because it was just so intense and hot and bright within these spaces. So those lessons I had to really learn quickly about how you do adapt the influence of what you've left in Europe to your own climatic conditions and intense sunlight. And then that became an ongoing area of interest and intrigue. And the practice of Iredale, Peterson, Hook is that those sort of influences of European influence of architecture and how we do need to then adapt that to our own conditions and our own culture and our own experiences. So I think a lot of it has really been that transferring of knowledge, and it becomes a base. And in particular, Hans Scharoun's work has always been really intriguing because there's a strong approach, a social-minded approach to the work, and there's a strong sense that you enter into architecture with what should really be a sense of discovery. And when we start on a project with our clients, we begin with this sensibility that, well, we're going on a journey together. We don't know the answer yet. We don't know what the outcome of a design will be, and we really don't want to know that yet. We want that to evolve progressively over a period of time. And Hans Scharoun's work was always like that it would evolve out of an idea, and it was flexible enough that it would have this sort of strong relationship of parts, and the parts themselves would be intensely explored as to programmatic requirements. A meeting space would have a certain form of space that would enable it to meet in certain ways, whether it was around a big circular table. And then another part would click into that and embed into that, and there'd be a synergy between the parts and become this conglomerate, this aggregate of pieces that all made a sort of a certain strong sense to begin with. But also, I think there's also a very strong connection to place and landscape, and an intensity at the same time, an intensity of how one thinks about the city. So progressive, that sort of sense of being in the urban cities of Europe, and in particular Berlin, it gives you this real strong understanding of the value and the need for public space. And this is not privatized public space. This is absolutely free public space, and how one might actually start to want to use those spaces. And you can script it and you can design for so much of it, but at the same time, there needs to be this sense of freedom that you allow people to come and actually interpret these spaces in their own way. And I believe a lot of the more recent work that we're doing starts to embody this understanding of public space. With Yagan Square and Munich Park, which we worked on with Lions Architects, and more recently in South Perth, and now Cottesloe Beach with Aspect Studio.
You are listening to Architects Abroad, a podcast for Brickworks Building Products. If you want to see any of the projects mentioned in this podcast, head to the gallery at the Brickworks YouTube channel. We started the conversation talking about you and sort of seeing these country towns in Western Australia and them inspiring you. And then, of course, you've done lots of work in regional Western Australia. What's that been like for you?
Yeah. Well, it's regional and also remote,
right, yeah,
as well, which we're quite fortunate in a way that the diversity of experiences that we have within this state. When you go from tropic, subtropic, right down to deep, mature old growth forest down the bottom, within that verticality, there's such an extreme variety of experiences and also cultures. When we start to understand the ancient cultures of the traditional owners, as well as the multicultural nature of Western Australia being such a place of meeting for so many years, the immigration through and that remains in Western Australia, it's become such a great melting pot of culture that it's really, in some ways you feel like you don't need to, people often ask me, are you interested in working overseas? And I go, well, we really feel in some ways that we're already doing that because of the variety of experiences that we're working in. And, to go into one remote town or a regional town, there's a real strong sense of pride within those towns. They're all happy to get in and be dirty to contribute to a project. But you also understand that there's a real sense of that, there's pride to have the project, but there's also going to be great pride in owning the project at the end and running that facility and using that facility, and that they'll respect it and they'll care for it and it's theirs. Like there's a sense of great ownership over it. So it's been an intriguing one in terms of moving around the variety of experiences, and really the diversity is something that I could not really. When I compare it back to the European travels, the thing of going from one country culture to another, where there's a distinct border, and you leave one country which has its particular culture, and then you go on to another with its particular culture. And in many ways, Western Australia exhibits that without necessarily going from country to country or from region to region. It's more of a sort of melting pot of cultures, and they actually all together in intriguing ways with various nuances and various relationships.
And there's a great sense of Western Australian pride coming through. You're not ready to keep the border up forever, are you?
Well, once we are embracing isolation. And it's one thing that we've always challenged is sort of sense that it used to be maybe 20 odd years ago or so, or even 15 years ago. There used to be the tyranny of distance, and isolation was exactly that. But we started to realise that isolation doesn't really exist with current forms of communication and technology. The internet has been that great destruction of isolation, which is a fantastic thing. But now we're happy to be physically isolated.
It's my greatest disappointment. One of my great disappointments of the year that I probably won't be able to get over there to tour at the moment, and it's the one place that I'm missing the most. But we'll get there. It will open it up sooner or later. Now, we should talk about your new house. How new is it, and what stage is it in?
We had a little topping out ceremony last Friday. The roof terrace went on, and the last of the brickwork was laid for the 2-story part of the house. So it was, and our builder, Mr. Brickman, 1987, went rogue and built his own Brickman up on the top of the parapet, which you might see on my Instagram. It was a beautiful moment where our bricklayer, who told me he'd fallen in love effectively with our house, 2 bricklayers, Jason and Jerome, that have been working on it for quite a few months, and he'd been dreaming about it. And I said, well, I hope it hasn't been a nightmare for you. But he said he's been dying to get back onto it because it's just been a thing of intrigue for him in terms of really challenging his capacity to think about the role of brick within a project. And we've been working with Brickworks on it, and we effectively have an entire outer skin of face brick with 2 different colours. One colour on the inside, which is carbide, and then salted praline on the outside. So we're also being 2 architects doing it for ourselves, myself and Caroline DeCosta. It's been a thing where we needed to impose a few rules for ourselves. The key one that I just felt we needed to introduce was around the brickwork was to try and minimise the impact of cutting bricks, try and minimise cutting of bricks and wastage, and to see what consequence that would have, which with a strangely odd-shaped site has had some really beautiful, unexpected results. And there's been a lot of working with the bricklayers on site and with the builders, with Limitless, just working through solutions on site to see what we can achieve. There's been a bit of flexibility, which has been good, so we can adapt things as we evolve.
And you've been laser cutting bricks.
Yes, Caroline, she's an architect by background, but also does a lot of installation work, art and other forms of installation. And one of her little experiments within the brickwork was to laser etch it. So basically putting it under a laser etch And with the glazed or the semi-glazed carbide brick, it's intriguing to see what then actually happens to that glaze. It effectively burns it and turns it white. I was expecting it to sort of burn it off back to the raw brickwork, but it actually doesn't. It creates a sort of white-grey film over it, which is almost like ash. It's beautiful, actually. And then, we had I think it was about 50 of those. We had a few left over, and then we decided that with the leftover ones, we'd let Jason and Jerome design their own little installation for up on our roof terrace with the remaining glazed bricks and the 3 remaining etched bricks.
Well, it doesn't sound like you're fighting, or you're just telling me that you're leaving that part out of the story.
No, only one, the kitchen. We didn't talk to each other for half a day. Caroline got up the next morning and I'd done a series of watercolour sketches. Yeah, I think it could be really cool. Caroline went, see, now you just flame it for yourself. You're going to say it's a great idea.
Amazing. Well, Adrian, it's been a fabulous chat. I suppose the tough thing for people at the moment is hearing your experiences and the desire to go. And it's enough to make all of us want to get on the plane and go, and we can't at the moment. But when things open up again, what is your advice to young architects who are interested in travel and what they should do? And
it's a really good question, because we have a lot of young architects with just start to want to travel. So we go, you have to travel. You need to do whatever that heart is telling you to do. You need to do it, and we'll try and support them. Our contacts overseas that even set up itineraries for things they need to visit, and it's quite funny. I'm always receiving photos and images and former employees overseas when said, you've got to go and see this building, it's amazing, and make sure you go to this part. As an Australian, it's still pretty good out there, I think, and you really need to go as far as you can while you can. We're all sort of keen and itching to get back out there.
Mate, well, let's hope we can start travelling sooner than later. Mate, really good to chat, and thank you very much for your time, buddy. You've been listening to Architects Abroad, which is a podcast series presented by Brickworks Building Products. If you'd like to see any of the projects mentioned in this podcast, head to the gallery at the Brickworks YouTube channel. I'm Tim Ross. Thanks so much for listening.